Good morning, church. It is my privilege today to share with you how God has rescued me from the dominion of darkness and brought me into his family of light. I was born in New York City in 1962. I grew up in extreme poverty in a roach and rat-infested projects and tenement buildings of Spanish Harlem. The halls of those buildings reeked of smell of urine and alcohol, and one would often have to step over drunken men to reach their apartments. And yet, despite all this, God saw to it that I learned about him from my grandmother, grandfather, and aunt. My bedtime stories were of Old Testament figures like Samuel and David, and I was taught to pray the Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm. I was taught to fear and love God. Yet despite his teaching I received during my formative years, I did not live as a disciple of Christ as I grew into my teen years. I was a slave to sin, and I knew it. I grew up in a denominational church, and no matter how much I tried to, quote, pray Jesus into my heart, it was obvious that I had no control over my sinful desires. As I grew up into my teenage years, I began to increasingly give myself over to my sinful desires. There was no control over the words that came out of my mouth: drunkenness, drug abuse, and sexual sin. I would often openly lament with girlfriends with whom I was engaged in impure acts that I was not living right. And I remember at one point as a teenager considering ending my life because I could not control my urges, and I felt in my heart that my destiny was sealed. I felt trapped. I remember specifically once sitting in my car as a high school student, after yet again giving into impurity and sexual immorality, asking God for deliverance. I remember asking God to send someone to help and teach me how to live the right way. That help would come when I least expected it. It was during this time that I received 2 scholarship opportunities, one to Southern University to play football, and the other was to attend the University of Florida on a journalism scholarship. Because my goal at the time was to become a sports writer, the University of Florida had a very strong journalism program. I chose Florida. Little did I know that it was God directing my steps. To answer that prayer, I prayed in my car as a high school student. Meanwhile, I remained out of control. Before I went off to college, I continued while living. It was during this time that a son was conceived out of wedlock, unbeknownst to me. My wild living continued even when I went to college. On one occasion, I got so drunk after a frat party that I barely made it back home. And even though I had all the freedom I wanted to carry on with my lifestyle, I became truly disgusted with myself. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was ready for change, a deep and radical change. After an unsatisfactory grade on my paper, I reached out to one of my classmates, Robert Jones, to help on my paper, and he invited me to his dorm so he could help me. When I arrived at Robert's dorm, he was there with another journalism student, who I would later find out was Dan Davis, a member of the Crossroads Church of Christ. Robert pulled me aside and told me, look, this dude keeps bothering me about going to one of his Bible studies, and I don't want to go. Now, I need you to tell him I'll be busy that day helping you with your paper. I agreed. We went back to Dan, and I told him just that Robert could not go with him because he was helping me with my paper. But even though I told Dan that Robert couldn't go with him, I asked him a few questions about his Bible study. He answered them and invited me to the Bible study. I declined, of course, because I was receiving help on my paper. The following week, the world-renowned psychologist B.F. Skinner visited the campus to give a speech. I'd read about him in high school in my psychology class and attended. We met in the O'Connell Center, and it was packed. The only seats left were on the floor of the basketball gym. I sat down and turned to my right, and who happened to be sitting to my right? None other than Dan Davis. I'm sure he felt at the time that God led him there. We talked a little, but settled in to listen to Dr. Skinner. While I don't remember the whole speech, I do remember Skinner's simple point. While man claims to know so much, man is ruining this planet. And I remember thinking, if such a renowned scholar has such a dim view of this world we live in, what hope do we have? I sat in stunned silence after that speech. Dan, meanwhile, made the most of the opportunity with me. He gently asked me what I thought about the speech. I told him, and after quietly listening, he again invited me to his Bible talk, and I quickly accepted. It was perfect timing. That Thursday, I attended the Bible talk with Dan, and the lesson was on the prodigal son. I was cut to the heart by Jesus' parable about a son whose choices in life and while living ruined his relationship with his father. And yet, despite his sin, his father was willing to forgive him, and it was as if the lesson was specifically for me. Dan asked me if I'd be interested in studying the Bible and coming to church. I quickly accepted. I remember going to church that Sunday and seeing so much love and warmth between people of different races. And I'd never seen anything like it. And the preaching was full of deep conviction. And once again, I was cut to the heart. After the lesson, there was an altar call. And I turned to Dan and I told him I probably should respond. And he stopped me and he said, let's talk first and continue with our study. I remember him inviting me to his home and sitting with him and his roommates and seeing young men living simple, righteous lives. And it had an impact on me. That week, we went deeper in our studies. I remember studying sin. And I remember Dan sharing Jesus' simple teaching that if we just look at a woman lustfully, we've committed a sin. And I remember thinking and saying that if that was the case, there was no hope for me. Then I remember him sharing Romans 7, where Paul shared his own struggle with sin and his appeal to God for deliverance from his sinful body. And I could not believe that the Bible contained such a passage. At that point, I was filled with a deep sense of remorse and sorrow over my sin. But a sense that God understood me and that he loved me despite my sin. It was overwhelming. I knew right then and there I wanted to give my life to Christ. And we continued studying the following Friday on October 9th, 1981. After a devotional on the crucifixion of Christ, I was baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of my sins. To receive the Holy Spirit, I remember feeling cleansed, free, and full of joy. I slept like a baby that night. But though I was a new creation, God had much work to do in my life to shape me into the likeness of his Son, Jesus Christ. And though my sin had been forgiven, my character had to be refined. And the church, God's family, was the perfect place for that to happen. It took the work of many godly men and women. I lived with Neil and Sarah Jordan for a couple of years, and it was such a big help to me. And it helped me to be what I needed to be over 9 years before I was ready to start a family. It was during that time that I met Debonair Brevet, now Rodriguez, and we dated and later married right here in this building on September 17th, 1990. Other than deciding to follow Jesus, marrying Debonair is the best decision I have ever made. We were fortunate to have people in our lives like John and Pat Brush, and a short time later, Joe and Pam Stearns, to help us in the early formative years of our marriage. And now, almost 33 years later, 4 children, we are still together serving God and growing stronger. That's what God can do for someone born in the humblest of circumstances. I'm not supposed to be where I am. Most men born in similar circumstances are now dead, in prison, or have had multiple divorces. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace to me was not without effect. I love my Father in heaven, and am so grateful to be a part of his family. God bless you all.